This is a dry run of the presentation to the Transform meeting on May 22nd. And I presume I will have been introduced. So I'm Phil Kithill, and I've just got some policy ideas to cope with the deep hole we're in terms of CO2. There are 5 of them. I've been told these are not great acronyms, but anyway, cost, COLA, quota, co-fund, and COGS. So one by one, cost is a CO2 supply taper. These are obvious ideas. Eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, stop the new permitting for oil and gas and coal on public lands, and phase out the importing and exporting of fossil fuels. The U.S. is about a 20% importer, actually, of fossil fuels. There are reportedly 500 billion annual subsidies, and who knows the value of the permits that have been issued and will be issued in the future. So that would result, I think, in a quick and direct reduction in CO2 emissions, ton for ton. Prices will increase, and it result in windfall revenues. Oil companies selling oil at $50 a barrel today. Price goes up to $100 a barrel. That's a $50 windfall revenue, and that money would be paid into the CO2 fund, the co-fund. So that's the first idea. The second one is COLA, the CO2 Labeling Act. Here's what you see in the grocery store when you buy many different products: a nutrition label, calories, fat, cholesterol, so on, serving size. How about a CO2 Labeling Act, total life cycle, CO2 content, broken out by the product or service? There should be services, including airfare, airline travel, packaging, transportation, recycling, disposal, indirect and other CO2 contents. So a very simple idea. The third one is quota. A little more complicated and involved, hearkening back to rationing in World War II. A monthly free quota is allowed for each person. Here's per capita CO2 emissions in 2017. You can see the US, we're at about 16 tons per capita. A sustainable lifestyle is about a little under 8 tons. And that's based on the uptake of CO2 as shown by the Keeling curve. From May through September, atmospheric CO2 actually decreases by about 5 parts per million. 5.5 parts per million. And that translates into roughly 8 tons per capita annually worldwide. So that's the green bar there. And you can see the other countries that are have per capita emissions above the sustainable level, as well as those major countries below. The world is now at about 5 tons per capita. And so actually emissions globally can increase if they come down for the countries that are way over. This would be administered by the banking system. So you have a checking account, you have a debit account, debit card, credit card, money market fund, whatever. Each of those funds would have a linked a quota of CO2 emissions that you're allowed to spend each month. And every time you spend money, the balance decreases. If you overspend your quota, you would pay a surcharge for the product or service. And the surcharges would also go to the CO2 fund. There would have to be hardship exemptions and other issues to support this idea. But we're in a deep hole, and we need to declare war on climate change. And World War II, we had rationing of gasoline, butter, meat, other core products, steel, and the same needs to be put in place now. The next one is the CO2 fund. So this is funded from the windfall revenues and the quota surcharges, and it's earmarked to compensate victims of climate change. Flooding, extreme weather, loss of home due to sea level rise, industry downsizing and retraining. What happens to those airline employees? ground crew, flight crew, front office, whatever, when airlines are downsizing because we cannot afford the air travel like we currently have. There'd be many limits. Individual persons would be applicable, not organizations. Maybe the property loss would be prorated based on the original cost. So you would not earn a profit from this fund, but at least you get your money back. And the retraining, that might have to be a cost share. There'd be many other issues with this program, but it would provide the funding needed to support the dislocation from climate change. And then the fifth idea, COGS, the Corporate Gigaton Challenge. So here are an example of the top 10 stock exchanges and the market cap of each and how many listed companies. The top 10, 61 trillion market cap. Market cap is price times number of shares issued. 30,000 listed companies on these top 10. An example of market cap, Google, 822 billion, ExxonMobil, 330, General Motors, 53 billion. So the market caps actually could be considered overstated by the cost of the free emissions, which have enabled these companies to provide us, we're the culprit, goods and services over these many years. And so in this plan, the large corporations would pay for negative emissions. They have not paid for putting CO2 in the atmosphere up until now, but now they would have to pay. And they could do that and erase their carbon footprint by paying in common stock, not cash. This preserves the company's liquidity. There's no change to its business model. It continues to provide this products and services that we all buy. Hopefully we'll buy less under the quota idea. This would be a direct subscription. There's no intermediate, very efficient, no intermediaries, no government regulations or interference, and a year-by-year contract. So their shareholders would be diluted because these companies would issue shares to pay for negative emissions. And that means more shares, and that means the existing shareholders own pro rata less. But the markets are now giving preference to sustainable companies. So that drives up the price. And as companies subscribe to this, they become 100% sustainable. Their price will go back up, and the shareholders recover their market cap. This also is a considerable competitive advantage for the companies that subscribe. They get bragging rights. They can tell their customers, we're now net negative CO2. We're supported, we're 100% sustainable. So that's a big marketing advantage. Here's an example. ITW, probably never heard of it, market cap 51 billion, is faced with a shareholder resolution to comply with the Paris Accord and with the CO2 disclosure effort. And their cumulative emissions are under business as usual if they do not take on and comply with the disclosure requirements, are going to go up from 500,000 tons to 14 million tons cumulative over the next 15 years. The emissions that could be removed are a gigaton under this program. And so their cumulative net CO2 emissions would go down, plummet. And what would happen to the stock price? In the gray line, the trend line stock price is going to go up from today's $140 to about $320 in 15 years under business as usual. That's their trend line growth. The share price to break even, for the investors to break even, only has to be about $20 higher at the end of the 15-year period. That's only 6%. Now, these numbers assume a $17 a ton cost to remove the gigaton. Depending on who the supplier is, it could be different. But that gives you an idea of how the corporate gigaton challenge could work. So in summary, here's a table of the actors and the timelines and the volumes and costs. So the cost, the CO2 supply taper would have to be a national program. It could be administrative, stop the permitting, stop the importing and exporting, phase it out. Should begin as soon as possible. Can end when fossil fuels get to zero. In the US, if it's as an importer of about 20% net importing, that would roughly equal a gigaton of CO2. And if the cost is $50 a ton, just as pick a number, $50 billion cost. Not too bad. CO2 Labeling Act could be done actually at a subnational level, state by state. It'd have to be a legislative action, should begin as soon as possible and go on forever. There's no volume associated, but there would be public awareness, and the cost would be low. It wouldn't cost much at all to have this information. The quota would have to be national legislated. If it reduced in the US our emissions from 16, per capita emissions from 16 tons to 8 tons, that would be about 2.5 gigaton volume. And at $50 a ton, we're talking 125 billion to have that quota to become sustainable as a country. The co-fund, add up the volume of the cost and the quota, you would get 3.5 gigatons of equivalent value going in, $175 billion to support the dislocation from climate change. And COGS is Corporate Gigaton Challenge. Negative emission providers and the multinational listed corporations are the actors. It's a direct subscription. Can begin as soon as possible. The target is getting CO2 under 350 parts per million, removing CO2 to achieve a stable climate. The volume, let's say we need to bring down 100 parts per million. There's about 8 gigatons per each part per million, so 800 gigatons removed by negative emissions technologies. At $50 a ton, that's $4 trillion. Sounds like a lot. It's 5% of the global market cap of these large companies. So that's very doable. Now, in conclusion, what do? Get active. On climate change.